Most guests will spend a full day at Disneyland and never notice a single thing that Imagineer John Hench built. That's not an accident. His entire design philosophy was built around one idea, that the best design is the design you never consciously see, but almost definitely feel. Hench spent 65 years at Disney, worked with Walt, and became keeper of his intentions. So today, we're exploring 6 places where his fingerprints are still unmistakably in the parks, including one place that didn't even exist when he was alive. Let's start with an obvious one. The most recognizable structure in all of Disneyland is only 77 feet tall. This is a key fact because a 77-foot building should feel underwhelming, and yet it doesn't. That's purely a Hench influence. He developed the castle's pink palette using a principle straight out of atmospheric optics. In other words, the lower sections are warm, saturated pinks. As your eye moves upward, the color transitions to cooler, lighter blues, mimicking the way haze naturally makes distant objects appear faded. Your brain interprets cooler and lighter as farther away, and the castle reads as taller than it physically is. This palette logic was pure Hench. He designed it around Southern California's specific sky conditions. This was forced perspective via color and action. The 2019 reimagining, led by Imagineer Kim Irvine, who was mentored by Hench, was explicitly described as finally realizing Hench's original, more colorful, and saturated vision for this icon. Hench specialized in park experiences as storyboards, where spatial layout, color, and detail were designed to create feelings of harmony. Next, we're going to take a look at a design problem that became a Hench masterclass. But stay until the very end, because number 6 is the most significant proof of all. It involves a themed environment that didn't even exist when Hench was alive. But first, let's walk over to the wishing well. This one requires you to stop and look carefully. In 1960, an anonymous Italian sculptor donated a set of marble figures of Snow White and all 7 dwarves. The problem? Snow White was carved the exact same size as the dwarves. Walt brought Hench in to fix it. His solution is still there today. He placed Snow White at the top of a tiered waterfall, elevated and set back, the farthest point from the guest's natural eye level. The dwarves are at the base, closer to the walking path. Distance does the work. Your brain reads the elevation and depth as correct scale. Notice how Snow White's figure appears naturally larger, not because the stone is bigger, but because the composition tells you it is. This is forced perspective applied not to architecture, but to a real-world error. It's one of the most significant magic tricks that Imagineering has produced. New Orleans Square opened in 1966 as Disneyland's first entirely new land expansion. Hench and Imagineer Herb Ryman collaborated to design this new environment. What's important is that New Orleans Square is not just a pretty backdrop. It's a working model of Hench's land as attraction thesis. Walk through it slowly. The streets curve intentionally so you never see the full land at once. The balconies overhead create a compressed, layered architecture that reads as genuinely inhabited rather than a background for a ride queue. Hench insisted on real wrought iron rather than cheaper substitutes because he believed guests could sense fakeness even when they couldn't consciously identify it. The upper level space above Pirates of the Caribbean, now operating as 21 Royal, was originally designed as Walt Disney's private apartment. Hench and Dorothea Redmond conceived it as a 19th century Louisiana residence, with views directly over the rivers of America. What's still visible today is the entire grammar of this land. The compressed footprint, the wrought iron, the elevated terraces, the way the architecture frames Pirates' entry without competing with it. This is a prime example about how a themed environment earns its own credibility. This philosophy, authentic material, controlled sightlines, no visual contradictions, is exactly what we're going to see pushed to its extreme in Cars Land coming up. And the reason it works there is the same reason it works here. But first, let's move over to Tomorrowland. The most recognizable of Hench's structural designs is the exterior of Space Mountain. Hench designed the attraction years before the technology needed to make the ride come to life was readily available. The concept began in the 1960s. The Disneyland version opened in 1977. Here's what separates this from standard show building design. Hench described the exterior as a visual representation of dispersed energy, the literal physics of what's happening inside. Exterior steel beams, each one a structural rib, arranged into a conical silhouette that didn't have the boxiness of a typical building. Look at the exterior beams along the base of the cone. They're not surface detail, they're the actual structural load system made visible. This is significant because it established the template for what Imagineers now call the weenie in its most evolved form, a landmark that draws you toward it and explains itself on the way in. Space Mountain tells you in structural language that something with velocity and gravity is happening inside its conical walls. The Plaza Inn is the least discussed Hench contribution on this list, and possibly the most revealing about how he thought. Hench attended a formal food and restaurant management course at UCLA specifically to prepare for this project. He designed the building as what he called a solarium with a live aviary of canaries and finches embedded in the structure, surrounded by live plants and Victorian-era fixtures he personally selected. This is significant because the Plaza Inn was never meant to be a place where you stopped and noticed. It was intended to be a reassuring space where guests could watch people and enjoy high quality food in a setting that felt like a dream, where the ornate detail and the interior scale worked together to tell your emotions that everything was fine. This is his architecture of reassurance at its best, built around the idea that Disneyland's most important product was not entertainment, it was the feeling of safety. Now, here's the one that reframes everything else on this list. Cars Land opened at Disney California Adventure in 2012. John Hench passed in 2004. The Ornament Valley mountain range, known as the Cadillac Range, is the visual spine of that entire land and was built and painted 8 years after he was gone. And it runs entirely on his color system. The same technique of atmospheric perspective used in Sleeping Beauty Castle was also used here. Recall that in the natural world, objects that are farther away appear lighter, less saturated, and slightly bluish. At the Ornament Valley Range, which stands approximately 125 feet tall, Rockwork art director Zsolt Hormé applied the forced perspective via color effect. The base is painted in deep, warm, saturated reds and browns, anchored, heavy, and grounded. As the rock face climbs toward the Cadillac Fin peaks, the color becomes progressively lighter, more muted, more sun-bleached. If you look at those peaks in Willie's Butte, your eye will be more challenged to see the top. The color has dissolved it into the California sky. This isn't just painting, it's engineering. The range is meant to represent a desert landscape that would realistically be thousands of feet tall. Building that out in DCA is physically impossible, so Imagineers built the feeling of it instead, using a color grammar Hench wrote decades earlier. What you're watching in Cars Land is not a tribute to John Hench, it's active deployment of his design system. His design language didn't get stored away, never to be used. It got handed to the next generation as the correct way to solve the problem. That is John Hench's legacy in action. So when you zoom out, this isn't 6 design decisions spread across 2 parks. This is one unified argument, still being actively used by Imagineers who learned it from someone who learned it from Hench himself. The castle is taller than it is. Snow White is bigger than the marble says. New Orleans Square is more authentic than its materials require. Space Mountain explains its own physics. The Plaza Inn calms you before you've ordered your food. And Ornament Valley is thousands of feet tall, if you let it be. Every one of those outcomes is deliberate. Every one of these is working on you right now, whether you know it or not. John Hench didn't design Disneyland to be just seen. He designed it to be felt. Of these 6 influences, which Hench design decision do you think has the biggest impact on the overall Disneyland experience and why? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video.